10 to 15 minutes I'll spend speaking about time binding as scientific social praxis. We all belong to a time-binding class of life, but are not time-binders in the true sense of the term. Time-binding is both a natural instinct for human beings as a potential waiting to be developed and an exercise undertaken consciously for achieving what Korzybski calls sanity. This undertaking has the characteristics of both science and the arts. Like Immanuel Kant's famous statement in What is Enlightenment, that by living in the age of enlightenment, one is not ipso facto enlightened. One can similarly say that time binding is both an inheritance and an act of careful cultivation. As in order to be enlightened, one needs to take a leap from the state of what Kant calls self-induced immaturity to a state of freedom to choose one's action. In the same way, to be time binder, one has to make the best use of the transition from childhood to manhood, which involves a rigorous practice of self-cultivation. Although endowed with the natural gift of remembering what had happened in the past and of looking forward to the future with some sense of speculative confidence, we as human beings have yet to make the best and proper use of this potential for improving the condition of mankind. A remembrance of the past is activated through our readings of history, mythologies, folk narratives. But unless the efficacy of the knowledge gained through these readings is tested through and modified with our actual experience of living in the present, we will not be able to become time binders in the Korzybskian sense. Korzybski suggests that those who are dedicated to the project of time binding must understand that it is not something that is inherited or natural for every human being, but a carefully cultivated practice aimed at making the human world less violent and tension-ridden. His entire scientific and social work lays in the project. In fact, his notion of general semantics is implicated in this vision. The various attributes of general semantics that he has spelled out in his writings all converge as contributor factors to this vision. While the first man survived and then triumphed over other animals by virtue of the power inherent in him, he had to systematically sharpen and refine his innate capacity in order to build civilizations and sustain them over time. So, as an ongoing semantic activity, time binding has thus a futuristic direction, while being dedicated to a project of reclamation of time past. In Korzybski's words, it involves a process of selecting, digesting, and observing the impressions received from the environment. How is this master trope of time binding conceptualized in the scheme of general semantics? In his first book, The Manhood of Humanity, 1921, Korzybski employs this trope elaborately in order to suggest that the task before the humanity devastated by the war is to reconstruct the world by re-energizing the dormant energy of time binding as a catalytic force of change. He uses two interconnected words, circularity and self-reflexivity, to imply that time binding is premised on the notion of continuity and completeness on one hand, and self-generation on the other. Circularity implies that time binding at the dawn of human's evolution looks forward to a realization of the self-fulfilling task. As an impulse that defined the nature of humanity at the beginning and propelled it on its onward march, time binding became a scientific practice to give a new orientation to the maturing consciousness of man. This maturity involves appropriate use of language for enabling healthy communication. The transference of neurological stimulus in the object level to definition and naming at the level in the most complex transition that require constant vigilance and attention. Korzybski recommends the practice of delay at this stage. This delay is needed to provide a smooth passage of one's instinctual response to an object abstracted from the event to its subsequent translation into language at the signifying mode. At the heart of this smooth transition lies the coordination between the thalamic and the cortical reactions. If one reaction overshadows the other in the excess, there will be asymmetry in communication, which will cause what Korzybski calls insanity. This delay is needed to keep in mind the distinction between the object level and the level in the perceptual process. The entry of language or science system into the field of perception is when the question of humanity comes into being in its perpetual attempt to return to the event level to test out the hypothesis through verification of language. Does not fully succeed in articulating what it perceives at the silent level, as by nature silent level is unfathomable. This is why Korzybski says cryptically, map is not the territory. Language is the map, event is the territory. Through its constant abstraction of what one receives as a stimulus from the nervous system, language is never able to see into the life of things. However, the realization of this unintelligibility makes our struggle to know more pertinent. In Korzybskian words, thus all our fundamental deeper knowledge must be and can never be anything but hypothetical, as what we see, hear, feel, speak about and infer is never it, but only our human abstraction about it. This experience could be called the aporia of circularity. We humans, aporia of circularity, we humans are fated to face. So theory is built on theory, and in the perpetual process of self-begetting, we return to the source of origin in order to move away from it. Within such a self-enclosed structure, time-binding as an experience has its resurgence as an immanent force. It is conceived as both a producer and a product of civilizational instinct. It is circular because humanity is a cause as well as an effect of consciousness of time binding and the process of abstracting. This feedback mechanism, according to Korzybski, may be considered as an unprecedented, unique organic spiral of feedbacks, he says. The metaphor of Mobius strip is often used to suggest this interpenetrability between words and objects. What is so scientific about time binding? As a mathematician and an engineer, Korzybski thought that only through the proper use of scientific method we could be able to build a sane society. Scientific thinking implies building on the footprints of the past and passing on the fruits of scientific achievements to posterity. Like an engineer building bridges for free movement of people across space, the time binding builds bridges across time. Richard Feynman, the distinguished physicist and Nobel laureate, stumbles upon the word time binding as if in an epiphany to indicate that it encapsulates in its unobtrusive density the very nature of scientific spirit. In an essay called What is Science?, he echoes Werner Heisenberg's thesis from Physics and Philosophy that without the creative appropriation of the knowledge produced by the ancient philosophers, who were also scientists to some extent, it would have been impossible for modern science to become innovative. Hindsight always leads to foresight. Memory is prophecy, as someone said, with cryptic assertiveness. Feynman further clarifies the implication of the time-binding method by suggesting that through experience of the world at a particular time and context, one could know what needs to be transmitted and what would be rejected. And this conscious decision will go a long way in improving the quality of life as it moves on. Time-binding therefore includes an aspect of choice in passing on the benefits of the past. It also implies that even the racial memory of guilt inherited by a person could be a turning point in one's career. As Nathaniel Hawthorne's oppressive Puritanic past provided him with a context to write about the excesses of Puritanism in his aesthetic catharsis. When Walter Benjamin says that the story of civilization is also the story of barbarism, he perhaps makes a similar point. That is why Korzybski emphasizes the term conscious time binding, because one needs to be conscious what one should be passed on, what should be passed on, and what to be rejected. In Feynman's words, and that is, I'm quoting Feynman, and that is what science sees, the result of the discovery that is worthwhile, rechecking the new direct experience and not necessarily trusting the race from the past. In his further elaboration, he says that it is necessary to remember the value of science, not only so that we will become better citizens, more able to control nature and so on. There is the value of the worldview created by science. There is the beauty and the wonder that is discovered through the results of these new experiences. That is to say, the wonders of the context which I just remind you of, that things move because the sun is shining, which is a deep idea, very strange and wonderful, unquote. By making a distinction between science and religion, Feynman says, while religions are dissipated by following form without remembering direct content of the teaching of the great leaders, science contains within itself the lesson of the dangers of belief in the infallibility of the greatest teachers of the preceding generation. One more minute. This is more or less close to Korzybskian thought and sums up beautifully the essence of time binding. As a time binder, a human being should be conscious of the efficacy of time binding as an art dedicated to achieving the ultimate goal of mankind for creating a society without discord and violence. It may sound somewhat utopian, but one should attempt to move toward the end. According to Korzybski, a true scientific spirit is in knowing the world in detail through a closed empirical study of it. Time binding is not meant to bind segments of time, past, present, and future, as if they are disparate parts, but to see them as a whole, a continuum of experience, mutually supportive and interpenetrative, so that you do not break them into fragments. This idea has been employed by writers and philosophers like Bergson, Proust, and T.S. Eliot. Eliot, in Bert Norton in 4 Quarters, writes so evocatively on the notion of time binding. Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contains in the time past. If all time is eternal present, all time is unredeemable. Unquote. The scientificity of time binding is an abstracting process involves the way feelings and thoughts at silent level are translated into language in order to convey to us the world what it means to be human. As I've suggested above, the most fundamental nature of time binding is to distinguish between the silent level of perception and the verbal level, and the verbal level. And the silent level perception takes place as a thalamic reaction. In the verbal level, the cortical takes over. In order to achieve a proper mode of communication, the integration between the thalamic and the cortical would take place. If you do not allow the silent level perception to settle down in order to prepare the ground for a cortical reaction, there will be confusion of levels causing mis-evaluation of human potential. But when there is an overload of the cortical at the cost of the thalamic, one needs to redress that imbalance by resorting to a mode of creative diversion like listening to music or walking that frees the mind from too much preoccupation with theory and allows it to receive the flow of the thalamus. Half a minute. These intermittent breaks could also be achieved by stylistic devices. Korzybski's notion of science is allied to the notion of sanity. Anyway, I have to go abruptly stop here because Corey is he's the real. I'm time binder, he's a time bound person.